If you don't mind, we can proceed to the following presentation, which will be given by Fábio Serranito. Very glad to introduce him to you. He's a longtime colleague and friend. We have studied ancient philosophy together and have had many discussions on the topic. He is currently a teaching fellow in classics in the University of Leeds and also a member of the Nova Institute of Philosophy in the University of Lisbon. He finished his PhD in 2015 with a dissertation on the concepts of madness and lucidity in Plato's Phaedrus. He's a specialist in ancient philosophy, and he works mostly on ethics and philosophical anthropology on the topics of care, love, ways of life, the interaction between philosophy and other literary genres and other intellectual disciplines. His most recent publications include a book chapter on the care of the self and Alcibiades' life project, a book called Rediscovering Alcibiades Major, and Mania and Aletheia in Plato's Phaedrus, published in 2019 in the Classical Quarterly. And today he will present a paper with the title Foucault, Reader of Plato, the Problem of Epimeleia tou Biou.
Good. Yeah, I noticed. I'm still muted. Well, thank you, Hélder, for the presentation, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. I promise I will make this as painless as possible. Right, so I will at some point try to share my screen. There's nothing special about what I'm going to try to share. It's just a kind of replacement for a handout, which if this was a live event, I would have prepared. So it's just so that you can read the quotations I'm going to be referring to or going to be reading. Right, so let's begin. In 1984, in what would prove to be his final set of lectures at the Collège de France, just months before his death, Foucault revisits his own 1982 reading of the notion of Epimeleia tou in Plato's First Alcibiades. In doing so, Foucault displays what is perhaps one of the greatest virtues one can have as a thinker and a philosopher, an ability to look again, to question and revise one's assumptions, and to discover and form new ideas and thoughts and insights within an open-ended and dynamic inquiry. In the 1982 lectures, entitled, as we know, L'herméneutique du sujet, Foucault finds in the First Alcibiades a fertile ground for his examination of the care of the self, souci de soi. In the First Alcibiades, Socrates approaches Alcibiades about his great ambition in life project, becoming superlatively powerful and prestigious. Throughout a big chunk of the dialogue, Socrates shows that Alcibiades lacks the knowledge and ability necessary to execute his project. It is in this context that Socrates points out the need for an Epimeleia tou. Alcibiades needs to take care of himself as a preliminary stage to his entry into public life. This care of the self entails self-knowledge, which in turn entails a recognition of one's own condition and limitations. But taking care of oneself also entails looking for what is missing, self-knowledge, knowledge of justice, and so on. But the question regarding the care of the self leads to another closely related question. What is this self that must be taken care of? According to Foucault's reading of the First Alcibiades, the Epimeleia tou proposed in this dialogue is in fact an epimeleia tes psyches, a care of the soul. As the most divine part of what constitutes a human being, the soul stands apart from the body and the other beings that belong to the body as the privileged object of care. But this care involves a fundamental component of self-knowledge. According to Foucault, in the First Alcibiades, the Delphic gnomic principle of gnothi salton, know thyself, is tied together with the care of the self, which is a care of the soul. In order to care for oneself, one has to understand what oneself really is, and that is, in fact, psyche, soul. The care of the self is a care of the soul associated with the knowledge of the self. Foucault's conclusion is that the care of the self is understood in purely cognitive terms, and this is where we'll see if things go wrong with my presentation. Can you see this then?
My computer, it just says Fabio has started screen sharing, but it doesn't appear. I don't see anything else.
Wait a minute. I will read it, and if it appears, just let me know.
You can also send it as an attachment through the chat if you want.
Maybe that's better.
And who wants to follow and download it and open it. Now it started to screen share.
Oh, now I stop.
I'm seeing it now.
The problem with being impatient, isn't it? I will do it and I will read it and it will appear. Right. Je dirais que le platonisme a été plutôt le climat perpétuel dans lequel s'est développé un mouvement de connaissance, connaissance pure sans condition de spiritualité, puisque précisément le propre du platonisme, c'est de montrer comment tout le travail de soi sur soi, tout le soin que l'on doit avoir de soi-même, si l'on veut avoir accès à la vérité, consiste à se connaître, c'est-à-dire à connaître la vérité. So this is from, obviously, the 1982 lectures. The care of the self is a knowledge of the self, that is, in that self is the soul, a divine entity that is separate and distinct from the body and the others. Now, in the 1984 series of lectures, entitled Le courage de la vérité, Foucault revisits this question regarding Epimeleia tou from a different angle, complementing his reading of the first Alcibiades. It is as a result of his reading of the Lackeys that Foucault introduces a different kind of Epimeleia, which we could designate in an analogy with Epimeleia tou as Epimeleia tou Biou. Ici, l'objet désigné au fil du dialogue comme étant ce dont on doit s'occuper, ce n'est pas l'âme, c'est la vie, le bios, c'est-à-dire la manière de vivre. C'est cette modalité, cette pratique de l'existence qui constitue l'objet de l'épimélère. This is a modality of care of the self that is distinct from the care of the soul. It has as its object bios, not the psyche, and whereas the care of the soul consists in self-knowledge, the care of bios consists in what Foucault designates as épreuve de vie or épreuve de l'existence. Quand on compare le Laquès et l'Alcibiade, on a là le point de départ des deux grandes lignes d'évolution de la réflexion et de la pratique de la philosophie. La philosophie comme étant ce qui, en inclinant, en incitant les hommes à s'occuper d'eux-mêmes, les conduit jusqu'à cette réalité métaphysique qui est celle de l'âme, et la philosophie comme étant une épreuve de vie, une épreuve de l'existence et l'élaboration d'une certaine forme et modalité de vie. As the final words in this passage suggest, the focus on bios as opposed to psyche results in a kind of philosophical activity with more of a practical bend than the purely cognitive concerns of Epimeleia tou. In fact, Foucault insists at different points in the 1984 lectures on how this other modality of Epimeleia focuses on the way life is lived and the possibility of life being changed, molded, fashioned like a work of art. I will not insist too much on this particular aspect, as we will very soon have the opportunity to enjoy a discussion on Foucault's aesthetics of existence. But the contrast between the cognitive bend of the modality of the care of the self that has the psyche as its object and the practical bend of Epimeleia tou Biou is something we must not lose sight of. The object of this modality of care is not this being, this entity, this thing that we are, so the soul, but rather the way in which we are, the way in which we exist. It is a contrast between an entity and a mode of being. Now, this is the bit I will make a bit of fuss about. Bien sûr, il n'y a pas d'incompatibilité entre ces deux thématiques, la philosophie comme épreuve de vie et la philosophie comme connaissance de l'âme, mais je crois cependant que bien qu'il n'y ait aucune incompatibilité, bien que chez Platon en particulier, les deux choses soient profondément liées. Il y a là le point de départ des deux aspects, des deux profils, en quelque sorte, de l'activité philosophique, de la pratique philosophique en Occident. D'un côté, une philosophie qui a à se placer sous le signe de la connaissance de l'âme et qui fait de cette connaissance de l'âme une ontologie du soi, et puis une philosophie comme épreuve de vie, du bios, qui est matière éthique et objet d'un art de soi-même. So Foucault recognizes that these two modalities are not incompatible and are indeed linked especially in Plato. But he nonetheless emphasizes their distinctiveness. Foucault does so because in the 1984 lectures, he is drawing attention to this second strand of the philosophical tradition, which tends to be overlooked, in which truth is not something to be accessed as an object of cognition, but rather something to be lived, embodied, incorporated, and enacted in the way in which one lives. Now, my purpose at this moment is to look back at Plato's lackeys and see how the two types of epimeleia identified by Foucault are connected and interact with one another. In this, I am guided by Foucault's 1984 lectures, and I will pay close attention to the key moments within the lackeys Foucault identifies as particularly important. The idea is roughly to read the lackeys in dialogue with Foucault, as though we were, for example, in a seminar together. In other words, I will look at what Foucault looked at, but with a greater focus at the profound link Foucault admits exists between the two types of epimeleia he identified. And so in establishing this dialogue with Plato and Foucault, I'll try to get closer to an answer to the question of what is bios and what can be an object of epimeleia. Although I confess that I was probably a bit too optimistic when I wrote this last sentence. Now, the first key moment identified by Foucault is the speech that sets out the dramatic context of the dialogue. In this speech, Lysimachus, speaking also on behalf of his friend Milesius, asked Nicias and Laches, the two famous generals, for advice about the education of their sons. Understandably, Foucault sees in this speech a clear example of the theme that will be at the center of his analysis throughout the 1984 lectures, paresia. He does so because Lysimachus admits frankly to their own shameful situation. Lysimachus and Milesius are failed old men without any accomplishments and merits. For this, they blame their own fathers, who were prominent statesmen, who, having focused all their care on the matters of the polis, neglected their own sons and let them do as they wished without any direction. Since Lysimachus and Milesius do not wish to repeat their father's mistakes, they are now asking the advice of prominent successful men about how they should educate their sons, specifically whether they should hire the services of the master-at-arms Cecilus to tutor their sons. So we can see how into this very specific and pragmatic question, should our sons learn the skill this man proposes to teach, is folded in some very serious and very difficult problems. Well, we have resolved to give them our most constant care, and not as most fathers do when their boys begin to be young men, let them run loose as their fancy leads them, but begin forthwith taking every possible care of them. Now, knowing that you two have sons, we thought that you were above, etc. So they are asking the advice of the generals, and they want to join them in arranging some way of taking care of our sons. And so this is the priority. It's an application of epimeleia to those two young men. Now, Foucault makes much of Lysimachus' paresia in admitting to his and Milesius's failures, which are a result of lack of care on the part of their famous fathers. But we should ask ourselves, what does this failure consist of? What have they failed at? What goal, what aim have they failed to achieve? At stake here is what we could designate, borrowing Platonic terminology from Republic, as a kind of philotimic goal. So life's ultimate goal here is identified with obtaining and enjoying power, prestige, good reputation and the admiration of others. The means to obtain this admiration depend on the values of the community. The polis will admire those who behave and have accomplishments that correspond to what the polis values. In this specific case, this is the ability to persuade others, to give good advice in matters pertaining to the governance of the city, as well as competence in defending it militarily. These are the fields of action in which the grandfathers became prominent and for which the grandsons must be prepared. This is the good at which the epimeleia at stake here should aim. And so in admitting to their own failure and in talking openly about their shame at their lack of accomplishments, especially in contrast to their own fathers, Lysimachus and Milesius are not simply confessing that their lives lack éclat, as Foucault suggests. They're also providing us with a draft of what, in their own view, shared by their own culture at large, that éclat consists of. This is important to point out to prevent us from misunderstanding this éclat as a mere subjective judgment or impression. It consists in the performance of certain kinds of actions, the display of certain kinds of virtues, and the attainment of certain kinds of honors. And these are objective, concrete honors. For example, the attainment of certain positions and offices within the government of the polis. And so according to the perspective at stake in this speech, to fail or to be successful in the philotimic project, that is to be like Lysimachus or Milesius or like their fathers, decides the whole value of a life, since it is the pursuit of this good that is the guiding principle of life's actions and choices. And so what is at stake in the question of whether the boys should learn how to fight in armor is the lives of the young men in their totality, their value, their significance, whether they will fail at life or else succeed. And so even just from this brief overview, we can extract some important factors related to the definition and practice of epimeleia. We have an object of epimeleia, which are the boys themselves. The goal of epimeleia is to create the conditions for them to achieve the philotimic ideal, and the means by which the goal can be achieved, well, that is what the initial deliberation in the lackeys is all about. Will they learn this skill, or by learning this skill, will they actually achieve that philotimic ideal? Now, even in a non-philosophical perspective like the one represented by Lysimachus, we can already find something akin to an epimeleia tou Biou, although the term is never used, a care for the unfolding of a life in its totality. At this point in the dialogue, this care is primarily directed at the lives of the sons, but it nonetheless entails a diagnosis of the lives of the old men as well, and of the meaning of and value of life in general. And this care may assume the form of adjusting oneself to a certain model or set of principles. On the other hand, there's a recognition that this cannot take place by inertia. It requires effort, dedication, attention, and even the acquisition of new skills and knowledge. Without a beneficial and effective intervention, the bios will not advance towards the end identified as a good, but will rather go on chaotically, determined by immediate impulses. This implies that there is a possibility to mold and shape life as it unfolds, a possibility that depends on the application of epimeleia. So in other words, there's an alternative between a bios that as a result of an effective epimeleia is a success, and one that it is a failure. The second key moment identified by Foucault coincides with the first significant intervention of Socrates in the discussion. And like many of the Platonic dialogues, Socrates' inclusion in the initial discussion is framed almost as an afterthought. The discussion at first is set to include only the fathers and the generals, but Socrates is unexpectedly pulled into it by lackeys in the capacity of an expert consultant, since he spends his time discussing what are the best pursuits for young men. Now, Socrates lets the generals go first, but when he intervenes, when he finally has his say, he changes the whole direction of the discussion. And so yes, for a question must be decided by knowledge and not by numbers, if it is to have a right, if we are to have a right decision. So there's a moment, as Foucault observes, in which the political model, let's see if we can get a consensus or an agreement or a majority vote, is replaced by a technical model. The matter is not whether all or a majority agrees, but rather what is the opinion of those who possess the requisite knowledge to decide. This leads, as I said, to a change in the direction of the dialogue. Before, the question was about the proper course of action for the care of the young man, and this question was tied to the suitability of a specific skill in the competence of the one who was proposing to teach it. But with Socrates' intervention, the question shifts. It is now a matter of assessing whether those who are to pass judgment on these topics possess the knowledge and competence required to do so. So we go from an examination of Stesilaus and his skill to an examination of those who are called upon to make the first examination, mostly Nicias and lackeys themselves, so kind of second order examination. But in what do Nicias and lackeys need to be competent to properly judge this matter? In a word, when one considers a thing for any purpose, the consulting is in fact about the end, who Heneka one had in view to start with, and not about the means to be used for such end, necessarily. So we must consider our advisor too and ask ourselves whether he is a skilled expert in the treatment required for the end, which is the subject of our consideration, certainly. And we say that our present subject is an accomplishment studied for the sake of young man's soul, so tes psyches Heneka tes tu neaniskon, yes. So what we have to consider is whether one of us is skilled in treatment of the soul, technikos peri psyches therapeian, and is able to treat it rightly, and which of us has had good teachers. In this exchange, Socrates pinpoints the subject of the required competence. He does this first by identifying the end, that for the sake of which, the huenica of the deliberation. It is for the sake of the souls of the young man. Therefore, the competence required in this case is a competence regarding the soul. One needs to be technikos peri psyches therapeian. Now, I must admit that this is, for me, one of the most frustrating moments in Foucault's reading of the dialogue. While discussing this key moment in the dialogue, Foucault does not overlook the fact that the subject of this skill, of this techne, is psyche, the soul. What he does overlook, however, are the possible implications of this fact for his neat distinction between the care of the soul and the care of bios. And these are the two moments where he is almost, where basically just passes through this aspect of the therapy, of the therapeian being, having the soul as an object, but he always focuses in particular on the technical aspect of it, the fact that we require a techne, and he never focuses on what the object of the techne is. And so, as far as I can tell, there is barely any daylight between the concept of epimeleia and the concept of therapeia as applied in this context. One could perhaps argue that epimeleia has a more generic flavor, whereas therapeia is associated with the possession of a technical skill or competence. But even if we were to put that distinction forward, the fact remains that therapeia is a kind of epimeleia. The epimeleia of the young man is the subject of the discussion from the very beginning, and Socrates is not here turning away from that subject. In fact, he's introducing a measure of precision by pointing out what is at stake in these questions, that what is at stake in these questions is not simply the young man, but rather the young man's souls. So he's making it more precise. Now, the parallel with first Alcibiades is easy to spot. In that dialogue, Socrates identifies the proper object of Epimeleia tou as the psyche of the soul, the psyche of Alcibiades is Alcibiades himself, autos. It is the self of Alcibiades. This is done by isolating the soul from that which belongs and pertains to the soul, and that which belongs and pertains to that. All those entities that the body interacts with and possesses through a lengthy and complex dialectical discussion. Of course, Socrates does not go through a similar dialectical discussion in the Laches. The arguments are very different, but the result is the same, an identification of the soul as the object of Epimeleia. Likewise, whereas a great deal of fuss is made in the first Alcibiades about this identification, in the Laches this passes almost unnoticed. The interlocutors simply accept it without discussion. But neither do they make anything of it. They will, in fact, go on to discuss the notion of bios in some detail, paying no mind to psyche. Now, one could point out that the fact that nobody bats an eye when Socrates introduces the notion of psyche in this context is a sign of its lack of significance. It is inconspicuous because it's mere minutiae. However, while the notion of psyche itself is never discussed and examined in the dialogue, its introduction plays a structural role within the dialogue. And for this, I need to explain it in two stages. The first has to do with the introduction of the two criteria for finding out whether one is technikos peri psyches therapeias. And we know that the two criteria have to do what teachers did you have and who have you made better through your care. In fact, one could reduce the first criterion to the second, since the competence of the teacher is measured by the results of the teaching. Notice that the teacher needs to be himself good, since it would be absurd to know how to make others good while neglecting oneself and being bad. And the teacher needs to have treated the souls of many young men. In either case, the proof is in the pudding, in the concrete effects of the therapeia. Later, once the two generals accept being examined by Socrates, Socrates changes his approach. So this is after those two speeches in which Nicias and Laches reflect on what they know about Socrates and accept the proposal for the examination. And this is that very strange and complicated passage. So if we happen to know that sight joined to eyes makes those eyes the better for it, and further, if we are able to get it joined to eyes, we obviously know what this faculty of sight is, on which we might be consulting as to how it might be best and most easily acquired. For if we did not know, first of all, what sight or hearing is, we should hardly prove ourselves consultants or physicians of credit in the matter of eyes or ears in the best way of acquiring sight or hearing. Truly spoken, Socrates. And you know, Laches, at this moment, our two friends are inviting us to a consultation as to the way in which virtue may be joined to their sons' souls, and so they make them better. Yes, indeed. Then our first requisite is to know what virtue is. For surely, if we had no idea at all what virtue actually is, we could not possibly consult with anyone as to how he might best acquire it. I certainly think not, Socrates. So instead of asking for concrete evidence of people who have been made better by one's care to prove oneself as technikos peri psyches therapeia, Socrates is now asking for what makes the psyche better, arete. From this point onwards, the discussion regarding arete and the specific arete that is Andrea, courage, will dominate the dialogue. But the question about what constitutes the best epimeleia for the sons of Lysimachus and Meletius, and about the competence of all those involved in the discussion to adjudicate the matter, is never put aside. In fact, the importance of the discussion about courage lies at least partially in the fact that it is a test of the general's competence. The question is not simply what courage is, but rather whether the generals and Socrates know or can find out what courage is. This is relevant because, according to the terms of the discussion, you cannot be technikos peri psyches therapeias and therefore competent to judge what may or may not improve the souls of the young man if you can't even account for that thing which, when joined to the soul, makes the soul better, arete. Foucault rightly observes that Socrates shifts the focus of examination to the generals themselves, to what they claim to know and be able to do. But he overlooks the fact that the question about the competence of the generals is tied to the fact that the soul is the object of the specific kind of care they are talking about. This is easy to forgive because the psyche as an object of care is introduced without any kind of fuss or fanfare. And its structural importance is only evident sometime after it first enters the scene. And in between these two crucial moments, we have the spectacular moment in which Nixias and lackeys talk about Socrates himself. And again, we know that Foucault spends a lot of his analysis of the lackeys discussing these two speeches and connecting it with the Socrates parrhesiastic veridiction and so on. I've written about it, but I will skip a lot. I'm going to skip those parts because we are running out of time. And I want to focus in particular on the fact that the generals fail the test. I want to focus on the fact that they show that they are not technikoi peri psyches therapei, and that none of the people involved have that capacity. The failure itself, in my opinion, is significant because knowing what arete is important for exercising the epimeleia or therapeia at stake. And so to improve the psyche, the person exercising epimeleia needs to have a clear-sighted perspective on what arete is, and this is exactly what is being tested in Nixias and lackeys, but also of the means necessary to achieve that goal. And none of the people involved in the discussion possess the knowledge. They all fail. Now, the simple fact that the generals accepted the examination at all is remarkable. After all, they are, as Foucault puts it, des hommes éclatants, whose prestige could not be doubted, while Lysimachus and Miletius were failures, Nikias and lackeys were winners in the game of power and prestige. But the failure to achieve any conclusion in this discussion has consequences for the way of life of the generals. How can these men be considered masters in military matters when they cannot even give an account of the most crucial virtue for their field of expertise, courage? The parallel with Alcibiades is clear. The young man was also shown to be a failure, or at least a failure to be, because he could not give an account of the crucial virtue for the governance of the city, justice. The inability to give an account of the logoi of their claims makes any claims regarding the value of their deeds unsustainable. In the end, all the actions that were considered admirable and are performed ostensibly for the good of the city could be entirely pointless or even harmful, in the same way that learning to fight in armor could be pointless or even harmful for the sons of Lysimachus and Milesius. Now, one of the consequences of this failure is that all those involved are shown to be in need of epimeleia. And in this, I believe Foucault is entirely correct. He's also correct in identifying the importance of the Socratic practice of examination in the Basanizistai for that epimeleia. But we should not lose sight of the fact that while the general speeches focused on putting bios to the test and the relative value of logoi and erga, Socrates' dialogical practice focused on putting the logoi to the test, with his sights clearly set on finding who is technikos peri psyches therapeias. And by the end, he says something like, I tell you, gentlemen, and this is just between you and me, that we ought all alike to seek out the best teacher we can find, didaskalan hos ariston, first for ourselves, for we need one, and then for our boys, sparing neither expense nor anything else we can do. In the terms of the dialogues, the didaskalon hos ariston, the best possible teacher, has to be technikos peri psyches therapeias. That is what is at stake in the kind of epimeleia the boys and the adults are shown to be in need of at the end of the dialogue is their souls. The general's failure to give an account of their logoi regarding the most crucial virtue of how their lives are lived has an impact on the validity and value of their way of life. But the problem lies in their souls as the seat of their cognitive abilities, as the place in which the logoi are held, produced, and acquired. The failure of the generals does not consist in having done something wrong, as Nicias would suggest, when one's words not being in harmony with one's deeds, as lackeys would suggest. Not that these two aspects are irrelevant, but they are relevant in a secondary way as symptoms of a failure regarding the logoi. The form of epimeleia that consists in putting one's way of life to the test, so the Epimeleia tou Biou, is still an examination of logoi, even if these logoi are brought into this process due to their existential importance. So is putting to the test a form of epimeleia? If that's the case, maybe we could go as far as Foucault goes and identify these two forms of epimeleia with two different but closely related objects, psyche and bios. But I would argue that the way in which the discussion is framed in lackeys suggests otherwise. If indeed the putting to the test is a form of epimeleia, this is a form of epimeleia that still has the improvement of the psyche as its aim. The problem, of course, is that whatever connection there may be between bios and psyche is not explicitly examined in the lackeys, although I suspect that the key to this is arete. And by this I mean that I suspect that arete functions as a bridge between psyche and bios. Arete is the way in which the excellent psyche acts and makes itself visible in the world and in relation to others. In the end, I believe that Foucault's intuition that the two kinds of epimeleia he identified, that the two kinds of epimeleia he identifies are profoundly tied together, especially in Plato, is more significant still than he lets on in the 1984 lectures. After all, his aim is to identify and explore this other neglected strand of the philosophical tradition. However, I believe that the aspects Foucault found in the lackeys and that led him to modulate his thinking on epimeleia could be pursued even further, potentially to a revision of the very notion of epimeleia psyches he sketches out in the 1982 lectures. But that is a matter for another time. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Fábio, for this very detailed reading of Plato's and Foucault's texts. I'll going for discussion, and I'll also do as Marta did and group a few questions so that Fábio can answer them at one go, if there are enough questions for doing so. Michael, you had a question. You may proceed.
Yes, hi. That was a terrific presentation. Gave an awful lot of food for thought. I'm wondering if I guess I'm not going to take too much about Foucault, but I'm asking for a point of clarification on the lackeys itself. Isn't the fact that ultimately the generals cannot give an account of what courage is, that means that there cannot be technikoi, right? Because that's just what the techne is an ability to give an account of something, right? That's why cookery is not a techne, because a cook cannot give an account of what he's doing. He just knows things by experience, empiria. But given the underlying Socratic and perhaps Socratic, but definitely Platonic idea that knowledge and virtue are inseparable, if not identical, then if you don't know, can't give an account of what courage is, then you can't be courageous either. You don't have that, you cannot have that virtue. Does that argument hold water or not?
Thank you. Paulo?
Hi. Thank you very much, Fábio. You gave us a wonderful talk. made very interesting, great points actually. But I just wanted to ask a very simple question, perhaps a technical one. It's about in one of your slides where you show us the passage page of Courage of Truth, page 126, where Foucault translates a passage from the Lakeys. There's a quite strange insertion that I didn't notice when I was reading the dialogue, and I would like the Plato. I would like to know if this is an insertion of, it's an addition of the editor, right? Or
yeah.
Is it, yeah. Okay, so this is a very strange point, because and my question is this somehow in the Lakeys? Because I don't have the text with me, I cannot check it. But does this addition makes any sense in terms of translating the passage in the Lakeys? Because it seems to me that this edition is trying to make sense of Foucault's thesis. Because and what do you think about it? I'd like to hear you about this point.
Mm-hmm. And finally, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Mariana, yes. Please.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm recovering from a third shot of vaccine, so I'm not so presentable. But anyway, Fabio, thank you very much. I actually came to this conference to hear you talk. So it was very interesting what you said. And I agree with everything that you said almost completely. I just wanted to ask you a simple question regarding, I'm not an expert on Foucault, so although I read him, of course, I can only talk about Plato, try to talk about Plato and Socrates. So my question concerns the competence, or the existence of competence, or non-existence of competence as a prerequisite for being a teacher, especially with in connection with Socrates himself, because he always denies being a teacher and having any competence at all, especially except in love matters, ta erotica. So I think this is his only competence. And actually in Aeschines, he says that he doesn't know any mathema. So there is no knowledge that he has to be able to make people better, which is what you were talking about, the Epimeleia tou Biou. So if he doesn't know anything about making people better, why is he embarking on these experiments with young men, trying to show them what arete is? Is he really, in the end, we know that he was unsuccessful in many cases, but is he really corrupting the young man instead of teaching them how to be better? Because he doesn't know. He doesn't have any special knowledge and no art, no techne, through which he could do what he intends to do or what he wants to do. So for Alcibiades, he only says that he loved him and that he believed that through his love, he would, staying with Alcibiades and being with him, he would make him better. But we know it didn't work, or it ended in a failure. So that was my question, more or less. What could you say about this controversy about Socrates?
Thank you. And Fabio, before answering, let us add one more question. Annie also wants to ask something. Please go ahead.
Yes, so first I want to say that am I frozen? I was very impressed with your very close reading of both the Lakeys and Foucault. I've always had a question about one particular passage in the Lakeys, and perhaps I was inattentive for a few seconds and I missed it, but I think you didn't mention that passage, which seems extremely crucial for your interpretation. It's the passage where Socrates starts, pushing Laches a little bit and, pushing it towards Plane, and Laches is all confused. And then Nicias tells Laches, well, I think, Laches, you don't know Socrates. If you knew Socrates well, you would know that what he does typically is that he will question a person and question and question and question until they have to give an account of their bios. And I always found it very strange, because if you think of what Socrates does in most of Plato's dialogues, we don't see him challenging people about really the way they live. He never really does that. That's not the way he does it at all. So it's kind of weird. I wonder if you have an explanation concerning this discrepancy.
Thank you, Fábio.
Well, thank you very much for all the questions. I will start with the last one, because I'm going to react immediately. And the reason why I didn't mention that passage, it's because it's in that part that I skipped. And that's the only reason. But yes, I talk about that. And indeed, I think it's interesting that it is unclear how Nicias' description of how Socrates goes about his business corresponds to what we see in the Platonic corpus, because the way he puts it is, I like to be examined by Socrates because it allows me to look at the way I've lived and the way I live now, and to look at what I did well and what I did badly. And he uses this sort of weird terms that do not correspond exactly to what Socrates does, because it makes Socrates look more like a judge of ethics, and somebody who's there to adjudicate if your acts are commendable, admirable, or if they are blameworthy, etc. And that's not what we see Socrates do. But yes, that's actually a good point. Yes, it would be interesting to compare with Alcibiades. Yeah, I didn't think of that, but that would be an interesting point, an interesting way of going about it. But so and I think that might be at stake there, is a kind of tension between how Socrates is perceived by others and how Socrates was perceived by Plato, and how Plato wants to present Socrates. And we see this game of perspective in not everywhere, but in many points of the corpus, famously in, for example, the Apology. So that might be what's at stake there. But I think you were very perceptive when you pointed out that it would help my point, my argument, point out that, because indeed one of the things that is at stake in my conclusion is that what Socrates does is not exactly what Nicias and Laches think he is doing, or what he proposes to do. And that leads me to Mariana's question about the accusation of corruption of the young. And indeed, when we're talking about the Epimeleia, and especially the Epimeleia of the young, the accusation of corruption is always there somehow in the background. This is the guy who was put to death because he did the opposite, he was supposedly doing the opposite of what Plato is claiming he is doing. And in a way, you could see that many of the references, many of the exploration of the topic of Epimeleia in the Platonic corpus is in a way a kind of extended apology, an extended defense of Socrates. And you could read, for example, the Charmides in that way. You could definitely read the first Alcibiades in that way, in dialogue with the background accusation. And I don't need to remind you that we're not just talking about the explicit accusation in the Apology, but also the second background permanent accusation that Socrates mentions in the Apology, the bad reputation that he has throughout the city. What I would say is that there was the fact that he never claims to be competent in those matters is part of that defense from the point of view of how Plato designed these dialogues. It is also an application of irony, obviously, but at the same time, we could interpret the negative results in the examination itself as a form of epimeleia. And indeed, it's something that I didn't bother writing yet, but probably will go to the finished product, how we could read Foucault's Epimeleia tou Biou, so Foucault's focus on épreuve de la vie, as a focus on the method or a possible method of care of the soul, as opposed to a different strand, a different kind of care of Epimeleia tou. And one of the reasons I think that might be a possible way about it is that it seems to me that when we read Epimeleia tou in the first Alcibiades, in the way Foucault does it, we get a very restricted result. And for example, one of my frustrations when the first time I was reading, I read the 1982 lectures, the part about the first Alcibiades is, and then what? What does this mean? What does this amount to? So this epimeleia is knowledge of the self, and then what? What are we knowing actually? How does this knowledge amount to something very specific that in my mind should be different from mere knowledge, which is care? So what? And one of the things that made me like the 1984 lectures more than I liked the 1982 lectures is the fact that Foucault goes back and actually, in a way, he corrects that unilateral vision and adds something. Now, I think, as I said in my conclusion, I think he could go even further. And, maybe you would have, but unfortunately, we'll never know if you could have done it. But again, we are here to continue with our ancestors' work. Paulo, about your question, I think it's a mere clarification because it has the idea that when he talks, because it's therapeia, it has to be with the connection between therapeia and the modern idea of therapy, and therapy as a kind of connotation that is a lot more restricted than therapeia. And so when he says, c'est une technikos peripsyche therapeian, un technicien du soi, and not un technicien de la thérapie de l'âme. So people would imagine it as because imagining a technicien de la thérapie de l'âme, you would imagine as almost like a kind of doctor of the soul. So it would be kind of like a psychiatrist or something like that. And what he's trying to, I think the clarification of the editor is to make clear that what's at stake here is not something like that. It's something different that remains undetermined. I think that's just that. I'm not sure if I'm correct about this. There might be a lot more to it, but that would be my immediate reading of it. And the fact that he never insists on it again makes me believe that Foucault probably didn't see more to it either. Now, the first question. So I left you to the end, Michael. I hope you don't mind. That you cannot be courageous without knowing what courage is, and if this holds true. I am not sure. I know that there is a lot of in Platonic terms, yes, I would agree that you'd only be courageous if you understand courage as the ability to distinguish between what is a true evil from what, for example, is a mere apparent evil. That would require a diagnosis of what is the good for me and what is truly good for me. And so in that sense, I require not only a knowledge of what specifically courage is, but actually what the good is. And once I understand what the good is, I will be able to apply it in practice, and I will be able to understand courage as the application of the knowledge of the good in the specific circumstances for which courage is required. If Plato is correct in that assessment or not, I don't have an answer to that. It is possible that you could develop courage as a virtue in the sense that is developed in the Phaedo, the distinction between the virtues of hoi polloi and the virtues of the citizens. It would be possible, for example, that you be a very competent general and even the bravest of soldiers in that specific sense. But at the same time, because you are not able to give an account of what courage is, you probably wouldn't be able to competently, effectively, and without mistake or error foment courage in others, or apply courage to a specific situation without incurring in specific mistakes and misunderstandings. I'm not sure if I answered your question, actually.
Yeah, I mean, my question was oriented toward the use of the word technikos in there. Mm-hmm. Because you really, according to Plato and presumably to Socrates, if you can't give an account of X, you do not have the techne of X, as simple as that.
Yes. So in that sense, you wouldn't be able, if we understand being competent in military matters, the ability to use the soldiers in such a way that they will be able to face the dangers in an effective way, then yes, if you are not technikos regarding, if you don't know what courage is, mm-hmm. you won't have the techne of being a general, mm-hmm. or at least you will lack an important part of what that techne would require.
Thank you.
You're muted.
Thank you for warning me. Yes, I was saying that we still have 3-4 minutes. I don't know if anyone has a quick question. If there isn't, perhaps I could make one, try to formulate it quickly. So I was a bit surprised with one aspect in your interpretation, or the way I understood what you were saying. Because when Foucault talks about these metaphysics of the soul or ontology of the self, I get the impression that he's criticizing the fact that in texts like Alcibiades and in the Phaedo, the care of the self seems to depend on a kind of metaphysics of the soul, in the sense that one tries to identify what the soul is in itself, and tries to look at the soul independently of its own activity and independently of its the way it is a structural moment of life. So it seems to be a kind of perspective that he's criticizing, and not that one is somehow concerned with the soul, that the soul plays a certain role. So understood in this way, I don't see any aspect of this metaphysics of the soul in the Laches, at least in the passages you showed. Would you agree with this and with my understanding of what you said? And with
if you understand it in that very restrictive way, yes, in the sense that in the Laches there is no discussion of what the soul is. There is no idea that in order to take care of something you need to understand it in that specific way. That's true. What causes me frustration is the fact that I don't think the Phaedo and the Alcibiades it should be read like this.
That would be my second question.
That is the most fertile reading of the Phaedo and the Alcibiades. I think there is, although in the Phaedo clearly, in the Alcibiades as well, there is that idea between that idea of a separation of the soul as something separate, autonomous, different from it. I think that is inserted in such a way in the Phaedo and the Alcibiades that it is clear that the soul is intimately related and interacting at all times with the body and the other things that are not soul nor body. And so in a way, what I think is, if we just look at it negatively, which I think is a lot of what Foucault's reading of those texts will amount to, or lead to. If we read it negatively, the soul is not this. And then if you add to that negative definition of soul vague positive aspects, like it is what is divine, etc., 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 without any kind of without an attempt to try to nail down what that could be. And again, this is not Foucault's fault, or at least it's not an original sin of Foucault, because Plato often does not help us in this in any way, shape, or form. So we have to go and dig it out, if at all possible. But what we end up with is a metaphysics of the soul that it's unsatisfactory. At least that's my experience as a mere reader and not an expert in Foucault. I find it unsatisfactory. And in a way, I can see why Foucault then, when he goes to the lackeys, finds something different, something that will allow him to then introduce that other aspect of his genealogical project, but without a clear connection with that other aspect of Epimeleia, the Epimeleia tou Biou. And I find it incredibly interesting that he does have the intuition that the two things are related, intimately related, but then he does not pursue at all that connection. So yes, I would agree in general terms what you said.